It was a quiet evening in a small town. The sun was setting, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. An old man named Walter Reed slowly walked toward a small grocery store. He was wearing an old army jacket, the same one he had worn many years ago when he fought for his country. His face was wrinkled, his hair gray, and his hands trembled slightly as he pushed open the store's glass door. Walter had been a soldier once, a brave man who had risked his life for his country. But now he was just an old man living alone. His wife had passed away, and his son was always away on military missions. He didn't want to bother anyone, so he managed everything on his own. As he entered the store, the cashier, a young woman, gave him a quick look and then ignored him. Walter walked carefully through the aisles, picking up a few basic items: bread, milk, and some canned food. His hand shook slightly as he held the basket. After choosing everything, he walked toward the counter. The store manager, a tall man with a thick mustache, was watching him from a distance. He had always been suspicious of elderly people and homeless-looking customers. As Walter placed his items on the counter, his frail hands accidentally knocked over a can of beans. It rolled off the counter and hit the floor with a loud clang. The manager immediately stepped forward, his face twisted in irritation. "Hey, old man, be careful. This isn't a free buffet," he snapped. Walter bent down slowly, his knees aching, and picked up the can. "I'm sorry," he said softly. The cashier scanned the items. "That'll be £6.50, she said. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out some coins. He counted them carefully, but his hand shook too much. Some coins slipped from his fingers and fell to the ground. The manager sighed loudly. "Hurry up." Walter bent down again, struggling to pick up the coins. As he did, the manager turned to a security guard standing near the entrance. "Watch him. I don't trust him," he whispered. Walter finally placed the correct amount on the counter. The cashier took it without a word and handed him a small plastic bag. As Walter turned to leave, he suddenly felt a strong hand grab his arm. He looked up in shock. The security guard was holding him tightly. "Sir, we need to check your pockets," the guard said coldly. Walter's heart pounded. "What? Why?" The manager stepped closer, crossing his arms. "We saw you acting suspiciously. Did you steal something?" Walter's eyes widened. "Steal? I am a war veteran. I would never." The manager cut him off. "Then you won't mind if we check your pockets." Walter hesitated. He felt humiliated, but he had nothing to hide. With shaky hands, he slowly emptied his pockets. Just some loose coins, a small photograph of his late wife, and his old military ID card. The security guard smirked. "Guess we were wrong," he said carelessly. Walter sighed in relief and turned to leave again. But then, the manager's voice boomed. "Wait." Everyone in the store turned to look. The manager picked up a chocolate bar from a nearby shelf and held it up. "You forgot to pay for this," he accused. Walter frowned in confusion. "But I didn't take that." The manager stepped forward, pointing at the chocolate. "Really? Then how did it end up here near you?" Walter looked around, his old eyes filled with pain and disbelief. He had done nothing wrong, but these people were treating him like a criminal. "Call the police," the manager ordered. "But sir," the cashier hesitated. "Are you sure?" "Do it," the manager snapped. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived. They walked into the store with serious expressions. Walter tried to explain, but they didn't listen. The manager told them his version of the story, making Walter sound like a thief. "Sir, put your hands behind your back," one officer ordered. Walter felt his heart sink. "Please, you don't understand." The officer didn't care. He grabbed Walter's arms and twisted them behind his back. Walter winced in pain. "Hey, careful," a customer protested. "He's an old man." But the officers ignored the voices around them. Walter's military ID fell to the floor. The second officer picked it up and read it. "Oh, so you were in the army," he said mockingly. "Yes," Walter said weakly. "I fought for this country. I served with honor." The officer smirked. "Well, look at you now." They shoved him forward. Walter stumbled but didn't fall. His pride wouldn't let him. As they dragged him out of the store, a young man standing near the entrance pulled out his phone. He had recorded everything. The young man quickly sent a message along with the video. It read, "Sir, your father is in trouble." Cliffhanger. Who was this message sent to? And what would happen next? At a military base far from the city, Captain Ryan Reed stood in the training yard, watching a group of new recruits practice hand-to-hand combat. His sharp eyes studied their movements, analyzing their weaknesses. He had been through countless battles, trained in the toughest conditions, and had never lost focus, until now. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Ryan rarely checked his phone during training, but something inside him told him to look. Pulling it out, he saw an unread message with a video attachment. His expression remained unreadable as he played the video. The screen showed a shaky recording of an old man being mistreated, shoved, and handcuffed inside a grocery store. Ryan's grip on the phone tightened as he watched police officers drag his father, Walter Reed, out like a criminal. The sound of the officers mocking his father, the cruel laughter, the humiliation, it all played in his ears like a nightmare. For a long moment, he didn't move. His body felt cold, but inside, his blood boiled. His recruits continued sparring, unaware of the storm brewing inside their commander. Then suddenly, the phone cracked in his hand. He had squeezed it too hard. His fellow officer, Sergeant Lewis, noticed his clenched jaw and stiff posture. "Everything all right, Captain?" he asked cautiously. Ryan's voice was dangerously calm. "No, I need to go." Without another word, he turned and walked away. He didn't stop to explain. He didn't need to. The way his fists were tightening, the way his shoulders squared, it was clear that something serious had happened. Within minutes, Ryan was inside his quarters, packing a small bag. He didn't need much, just his wallet, phone, and a jacket. As he zipped up his bag, his mind replayed the scene over and over. His father, a war hero, was treated like a thief, a nobody. His father had sacrificed everything for this country, and this was how they repaid him. Unacceptable. Unforgivable. He grabbed his phone and dialed a number. The call was answered almost immediately. "Ryan," a voice asked. "I need a flight. Tonight," Ryan said. His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous beneath it. "Where to?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "Home." There was a pause. Then the voice responded. "Understood." Ryan ended the call and took a deep breath, trying to control the fire inside him. His father had always told him not to act on emotion, to think before reacting. But this wasn't just emotion. This was justice. Someone had to pay for what they did, and Ryan was coming to make sure they did. As he stepped out of his room and walked toward the base's exit, every soldier who saw him felt it. The shift in his energy. This wasn't just any trip home. This was war. The small holding cell was cold and smelled of damp concrete. Walter Reed sat on a hard bench, his old hands resting on his knees. His wrists ached from the tight handcuffs that had been removed only moments ago. He had been through worse in his life. War, loss, and battles no one would ever know about. But somehow, this humiliation felt different. He glanced around the dimly lit room. The walls were cracked, the flickering overhead light buzzed, and the metal bars in front of him seemed to close in like a cage. He never thought he'd end up here, not after everything he had done for this country. His back ached, but he refused to show weakness. If there was one thing life had taught him, it was to never let the enemy see you suffer. Outside the cell, two officers sat at a desk, laughing and drinking coffee. One of them, Officer Miller, leaned back in his chair and smirked. Did you see his face when we cuffed him? Thought he was some kind of war hero, he scoffed. The other officer, Jensen, chuckled. Yeah, well, being a hero doesn't mean much when you're just another old man with no power. Walter closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to stay calm. His whole life, he had believed in discipline, in patience, but right now, all he could feel was disappointment. Not in himself, but in the world. A younger officer, barely in his 20s, walked over hesitantly. His name tag read Collins. He shifted nervously, looking at Walter through the bars. Sir, do you need anything? Water, he asked, his voice softer than the others. Walter looked up, surprised by the kindness in the young man's tone. I could use some water, he said. Collins nodded and hurried off. But before he could take 2 steps, Miller grabbed his arm. Why are you wasting your time on him? He sneered. Collins hesitated. He's an old man. He hasn't even been charged yet. Maybe we should at least hear his side. Miller let out a loud laugh. His side? Look, kid, you need to learn how things work around here. We're the law. These people, he gestured toward Walter, are just nobodies. The faster you learn that, the better. Collins swallowed hard, but he didn't argue. Instead, he walked back to his desk, his shoulders tense. Walter watched the entire exchange. He had seen young men like Collins before, men who still had a conscience, still had a sense of right and wrong. But he also knew how easily that could be crushed by the system. He had seen it happen in the military. Good men turned cold because they had no choice. Walter sighed and leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes. His body was tired, but his mind was still sharp. He wasn't sure how long he would be in this place, but one thing was certain: his son would find out. And when he did, things would change. As if on cue, a loud buzzing sound came from the front desk. One of the officers checked the security monitor. A black car had just pulled up outside the station. Its headlights cut through the darkness, unmoving, like the eyes of a predator watching its prey. Who the hell is that? Jensen muttered, frowning. No one answered. But inside the cell, Walter opened his eyes, a small, knowing smile forming on his lips. He knew exactly who had arrived. The front door of the police station swung open with a sharp creak, and Ryan Reed stepped inside. He moved with quiet confidence, his presence commanding attention without a single word. The air in the room shifted instantly. Officers at their desks glanced up, sensing something was different. Something was wrong. Ryan was dressed in a simple black jacket, jeans, and boots, but there was something about him, a silent authority, a controlled danger. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, every face. He wasn't here for small talk. He was here for one reason. At the front desk, Officer Jensen barely looked up from his coffee. "Can I help you?" he asked lazily. Ryan took a slow step forward, his voice low but firm. "I'm here for Walter Reed." Jensen sighed, flipping through some paperwork. "And you are?" Ryan didn't blink. His son. That got Jensen's attention. He looked up, eyeing Ryan with mild interest. "Oh yeah, and what's the problem?" Ryan's jaw clenched. "The problem is my father was arrested for no reason. The problem is that I saw a video of him being mistreated like a criminal. And the problem is..." His voice dropped lower, colder. "I don't take kindly to people disrespecting my family." Jensen chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Look, I don't know what video you saw, but your dad was causing trouble. Store manager reported him. He was acting suspicious." Ryan's fists tightened at his sides. His father. Suspicious. A war hero who had given everything for his country. The injustice of it made his blood boil. Before he could respond, Officer Miller walked over, a smug grin on his face. "Ah, so you're the son. Listen, buddy, your old man got himself into this mess. He's lucky we didn't rough him up more." Silence. The room seemed to freeze. Every officer nearby stopped what they were doing. A thick tension filled the air. Ryan turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze locking onto Miller's. "Say that again," Ryan said quietly. Miller smirked. "I said." He never got to finish. In a flash, Ryan moved. His hand shot out, grabbing Miller's wrist in a crushing grip. Before Miller could react, Ryan twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees in one swift motion. A sharp gasp of pain escaped the officer's lips. The entire room went dead silent. No one moved. No one even breathed. Ryan leaned down, his voice calm, controlled, but deadly. "You think you're tough because you wear a badge," he whispered. "You think you can put your hands on an old man and laugh about it." He tightened his grip. Miller groaned in pain. Jensen shot up from his chair. "Hey, you can't do that." Ryan didn't even look at him. And yet, here I am, doing it. Another officer reached for his radio. Ryan's gaze snapped to him. "I wouldn't," he warned. The officer hesitated. There was something terrifyingly certain about Ryan's tone, like a man who had seen more violence than any of them could imagine. A man who wasn't afraid. Miller gritted his teeth. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. Ryan leaned in, his voice like steel. "No, you did, when you put your hands on my father." He released Miller with a rough shove, making him stumble back. Then, without breaking eye contact, Ryan straightened his jacket and took a slow step back. Jensen was the first to speak. "That's it. You're under arrest." He reached for his handcuffs. Ryan smirked. Then he pulled out his military ID and slapped it onto the desk. The room fell silent again. Jensen hesitated, picking it up. His eyes widened as he read the words. "United States Army, Delta Force Commander." Ryan's smirk disappeared. "Try it," he said, his voice deathly calm. Jensen swallowed hard. Every officer in the room now understood exactly who they were dealing with. This wasn't just some angry civilian. This wasn't just a soldier. This was a man trained in war. A man who had taken down enemies far deadlier than a couple of corrupt cops. Ryan slowly reached over the desk and grabbed the police logbook. He flipped through it until he found his father's name. Then he tore the page out, folded it neatly, and put it in his pocket. "I'm taking my father home," Ryan said. "Now." Jensen opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, the front door buzzed open again. A black SUV had pulled up outside. Men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the area. Military men. Ryan's men. Jensen paled. Ryan didn't even turn to look. He simply said, "Where is he?" No one answered. Then, from inside the cell, Walter Reed smiled. He had known this moment would come. And it was only just beginning. "You said." The hallway leading to the holding cells was silent except for the sharp echo of Ryan's boots as he walked forward. Every step was measured, controlled, like a predator approaching its prey. Officers who had been arrogant just moments ago now stood frozen, their eyes shifting nervously between each other. No one dared to stop him. As Ryan neared the cell, the heavy metal door stood between him and his father. Without waiting for permission, he reached out and grabbed the lock. He turned to Officer Collins, the young officer who had shown a hint of conscience earlier. "Keys," Ryan said. It wasn't a request. Collins hesitated, glancing around at his fellow officers. No one spoke. They all knew what was happening. He swallowed hard, then pulled the keys from his belt and handed them over. Ryan unlocked the cell and stepped inside. Walter Reed sat on the bench, his posture straight despite his exhaustion. He looked up at his son, and for a brief moment, the hardened expression on Ryan's face softened. His father was tough, always had been. But Ryan could see the pain in his eyes, the injustice of the situation weighing heavily on him. "Dad," Ryan said quietly. Walter let out a small breath, shaking his head. "Took you long enough." Ryan smirked. "Had to make an entrance." Walter chuckled, but then his smile faded. You shouldn't have come here like this, son. These men aren't worth it. Ryan's jaw clenched. They put their hands on you. That's worth it to me. Walter saw the fire in his son's eyes, the same fire he had tried to control in him since he was a boy. Ryan had always been ruthless when it came to protecting the people he loved. That's what had made him one of the deadliest soldiers alive. But Walter also knew Ryan's anger was a dangerous thing. Ryan helped his father up, steadying him as he stood. "We're leaving," he said. Walter nodded, but just as they turned to walk out of the cell, a voice called from behind. "You think you can just take him?" Ryan stopped. Slowly, he turned. Officer Miller stood there, rubbing his sore arm from where Ryan had twisted it earlier. His face was red with embarrassment, his pride wounded. He wasn't going to let this slide. Ryan tilted his head slightly. "You want to try stopping me?" Miller clenched his fists. "You might be some special forces guy, but this is my station. You don't make the rules here." Ryan took a step forward, his eyes cold. "You lost the moment you put your hands on my father. But if you want to make this worse for yourself," he gestured around the room, where his father's name had already been wiped from the records, where his men waited outside, where every officer present had already backed down. "Be my guest." Miller hesitated, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. He reached for his baton. Bad choice. Ryan moved before anyone could react. One step in. A sharp twist of the wrist. The baton never even left Miller's holster. Ryan had already trapped his arm and flipped him onto the ground in a single brutal motion. The air left Miller's lungs in a painful gasp. Before he could recover, Ryan pressed a knee against his back, twisting his arm behind him at an angle that made him groan in pain. Ryan leaned down, his voice low and deadly. "I fight wars for a living. You fight old men in grocery stores. Know the difference." Silence. No one dared move. Then Ryan let go, standing up as Miller groaned on the floor. He didn't even spare him another glance. Instead, he turned back to his father. "Let's go." Walter sighed but followed. As they walked through the station, the other officers stepped aside. Even Jensen, who had been arrogant earlier, said nothing. Collins, the young officer, gave Walter a small nod as they passed. Walter nodded back. The front doors opened, and the cold night air greeted them. The black SUV idled outside, waiting. Ryan helped his father into the passenger seat before closing the door. He turned back once, his eyes scanning the station. He wanted them to remember this moment. Without another word, he got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away. Inside the station, no one spoke for a long time. Miller sat up, holding his arm, rage burning in his eyes. "This isn't over," he growled. Collins looked toward the door, watching the SUV disappear into the night. He wasn't so sure about that. Something told him that Officer Miller had just made a very, very big mistake. The ride home was quiet. The black SUV cut through the night, headlights illuminating the empty road ahead. Ryan kept his hands steady on the wheel, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Walter sat with his hands resting on his lap, gazing out the window. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two men who understood each other without words. After a while, Walter sighed. "You didn't have to do all that, son." Ryan's grip on the wheel tightened. "Yes, I did." Walter turned his head slightly, studying his son's face. Ryan had always been a soldier before anything else, trained to eliminate threats, to act without hesitation. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was home. And Walter worried that his son had been a soldier for so long that he didn't know how to turn it off. "This isn't war," Walter said gently. Ryan's jaw clenched. "They made it war when they put their hands on you." Walter sighed again, shaking his head. "Son, I've faced worse men than those officers. I didn't need saving." Ryan finally looked at him, his eyes sharp. "It wasn't about saving you, Dad. It was about making sure no one ever tries this again." Walter didn't argue. He knew his son meant every word. They drove in silence for a few more minutes until they reached Walter's house, a small, modest home on the outskirts of town. Ryan parked the SUV and stepped out, walking around to open the door for his father. Walter shook his head with a small smile. "I can still open my own doors, you know." Ryan smirked. "Just making sure." They walked up to the porch, and Walter unlocked the door. Inside, the house was neat, but Ryan could see the signs of his father's struggles: the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, the medicine bottles on the table. His father would never complain, never ask for help, but Ryan saw it all. Walter sat down in his old armchair with a groan, rubbing his wrists where the cuffs had been. Ryan walked to the kitchen and grabbed a glass, filling it with water before handing it to him. Walter took a sip, then looked at his son. "So, what now?" Ryan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. His eyes were unreadable. "Now, I find out who let this happen." Walter sighed. "Ryan, let it go. I'm out. That's what matters." But Ryan shook his head. "No. Someone signed off on that arrest. Someone gave those officers the confidence to treat you like that. I need to know who." Walter frowned. "And then what?" Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone and sent a quick message. Within seconds, it buzzed with a reply. Ryan read it, then slipped the phone back into his pocket. Walter watched him carefully. "Son." Ryan finally met his father's gaze. "I won't let them get away with it." Walter exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. He knew that look in his son's eyes. It was the look of a man preparing for battle. And something told him this wasn't over yet. Not even close. "You said." The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Walter's small home, casting long shadows on the wooden floor. He sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, his hands steady despite the events of the night before. He had been through too much in his life to let fear creep in now. But something about the way Ryan had looked at him before leaving last night unsettled him. Ryan was a man of action. He didn't just get angry. He did something about it, and that worried Walter more than anything. A knock at the door broke the silence. Walter set down his cup, his instincts sharp despite his age. He glanced toward the window. A black SUV sat outside. But this wasn't Ryan's. Another knock, more forceful this time. Walter slowly stood up and opened the door. A man in a dark suit and sunglasses stood on the porch. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't military. But Walter knew exactly what kind of man he was. "Mr. Reed," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. "We need to talk." Walter crossed his arms. "About what?" The man smirked. "Your son." Walter's face didn't change, but inside, his stomach tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man chuckled. "Come on now. Ryan Reed, ex-Delta Force, a man with a reputation. He made a big mistake last night, and now he's stirring up the wrong kind of trouble." Walter's grip on the door tightened. "If you're here to threaten me, I'd suggest you rethink that." The man raised his hand slightly, as if in surrender. "No threats. Just facts. Ryan's not just dealing with a few corrupt cops. He's stepping on toes much bigger than he realizes." Walter narrowed his eyes. "Who do you work for?" The man ignored the question. "Tell your son to back off. This isn't his fight." He paused, then added, "before it becomes one he can't win." Walter stared at him for a long moment. He had seen men like this before, smooth talkers who thought they were untouchable. But what they didn't understand was that Ryan wasn't just a soldier. He was a force of nature. Walter exhaled slowly. "I'll tell him," he said. The man nodded, satisfied. "Good." He turned to leave, but just as he reached the steps, Walter spoke again. "You should be more worried about what happens if he doesn't back off." The man stopped, glancing back over his shoulder. Walter's face was calm, but his eyes held a quiet warning. The man smirked. "We'll see." Then he got into his car and drove away. Walter watched until the SUV disappeared down the road. He stood there for a long time before stepping back inside. He had no intention of telling Ryan to back off, because he knew something those men didn't. Ryan wasn't going to stop, and if they thought they could scare him off, they had just made the biggest mistake of their lives.